Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Khalil Doheny, and I'm the Director of Content Marketing at Digital Media Agency. Today, we have Jeff from Target Arm. Jeff, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Khalil. Thanks for having us.
Awesome, awesome. And then, Jeff, do you want to introduce our guest here today?
I will. Or do you want to go ahead and get started right now? I
Yeah,
don't know.
we're already having people trickling in. I think we can just go ahead and jump straight into it.
Okay. What I'd like to do then is go ahead and just start with my slide deck, if that's okay with you.
Let's do it.
All right. Hey, Khalil, just make sure you can see it okay.
Yep.
Okay, first of all, welcome everybody. This is a great webinar that I'm excited about having Steve Dickson, the former administrator of the FAA, with us. A very close friend of mine. We've known each other for a very long time. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'm Jeff McChesney. I'm the CEO and founder of Target Arm, and this is being presented to you by Target Arm in particular. I'll go through very quickly who we are and then turn it over to Steve because he's the main attraction. Let me just get this going here. Okay, first of all, I'll just do a quick a couple of minutes on Target Arm. Then we'll turn over to Steve, his background. I'll give you that, and then Steve's going to give us an overview from his perspective of the national airspace, the FAA, the interaction about getting rulemaking and approvals that are required for it. Then we'll open up for questions and answers. So the idea here is that we want an interaction. We want to be able to ask current requirements that any of you may have or questions that you may have so that Steve and I get an opportunity to answer them, predominantly Steve in this case. So just a quickie on Target Arm. Target Arm is a company that is in the robotics and autonomy space, where we've got our signature device is called TOOLAR, and it enables launch recovery of both rotary and fixed wing drones from any moving vehicle. We can do that fully autonomously, and we're now starting to do AI enhancements across the board with it. These are a couple of the displays that we've got to associate with those. But we have four products. The TOOLAR is a device and a hardware product combined with three software products, Tracker, TurboFly, and Maestro. Those four products enable us to do many, many commercial and military solution sets. So you can see over here from package delivery and oil and gas, all while you're moving from a vehicle or a vessel or an aircraft or even a spacecraft in some cases as well. So the idea is anything that's moving, you can launch a drone from and recover it. And that enables new business models that are available out to everybody. And in the military, it's pretty self-evident about how that will end up modifying what you can or can't do on a battle space. But why today's presentation is so important with Steve is the commercial aspect that's shown up there. And that is the national airspace and the FAA rules dictate what commercial business models can or cannot do when they can or cannot do those. And we're so proud to have Steve here with us today to help us understand what that means. Well, here's the background on Steve. Again, I've known Steve for a long time. It's a great honor to have him with me. This is really kind of special for me personally, and probably for him as well, when we look back on our careers together. But he's the 18th FAA administrator, and he was from 2019 through 2022. Steve was very, very important for the turnaround of the FAA, in particular, regaining the public's trust. That was a major factor, if you recall, because of the 737 MAX. I'd say a debacle, but due to the accidents that occurred to that, Steve personally made a comment to the world and said 737 MAX would not fly again until he personally flew it and certified it, which he did. Prior to that, Steve was at Delta Airlines, starting off as a captain and a line pilot, and then moved himself up all the way through to the VP of Flight Operations with the longest tenure that they ever had there. And he flew the A320 and the Boeing aircrafts, the 72, the 73, 75, and 76 as well. Steve's been inducted in the National Air and Space Museum's Wall of Honor. I helped and attend. I didn't help. I attended Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame induction for Steve as the class of 2024 just a couple of months ago. Steve has a law degree from Georgia State University, and that helped him tremendously with pilot negotiations and union labor situations, one of the main aspects that a VP of Flight Operations has to contend with every couple of years. When he was in the Air Force, back at the same time I was, he flew the T-38 Talon, and as you can see behind me, the F-15 Eagle that we both flew together as well. Steve's a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Academy, and was the cadet wing commander with me as his vice wing commander, with a picture signifying that in the bottom right-hand corner there of the two of us. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, Steve, that we looked like that. So just a little bit back there in time. So the good old days, that was fun times as well. And we've been together ever since, on and off. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve and let Steve talk about what he thinks is important for you to hear, and then give you the opportunity to ask questions of him, and he'll try his best to answer those.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here. Although I will say, if I'm the main attraction, we may be in some trouble. But anyway, but it's great to see you. As you can see, Jeff has aged better than I have, a lot more hair, and I think still playing hockey like he did while we were cadets, and but a great friend for many years. And, you know, as we were getting ready for this, or when he asked me to participate in this webinar today, sent me a note a few weeks ago and asked me to address, certain topics. So I hope these are the things that you're interested in. I'll take the first 20 minutes or so here to go through what I think are some important regulatory and policy issues, and really to try to put some context around why can't all of this happen faster and why can't it happen today. That's what we all want to happen. And so I'll talk a little bit about the current state of play, how the FAA has approached working with industry and the other departments within the federal government and internationally to move the drone or UAS space forward. Talk about the current status of rulemaking, particularly upcoming exciting developments, I think, on scalable beyond visual line of sight operations, or BVLOS as we call it. And then UAS traffic management, with some good new developments there. And then also just some kind of moving forward, just some considerations really for the next year or two. So the FAA, I think it's important to understand at the beginning, and this can be and has been hotly debated. It is both the aviation safety regulator and the air navigation service provider for the United States. In most of the rest of the world, those are separate functions, and in some cases, you may have a private corporation that's actually running the air traffic control system. So when we talk about the FAA, we have to understand that it has those two roles. And there are some disadvantages to that structure, but there are also some advantages when you look at the complexity and the number of stakeholders and the dynamic nature of airspace in the U.S. There is some synergy involved with having both of those under one roof, and I can certainly talk about that. Another thing to understand is that the FAA is one of 9 modes of transportation under the Department of Transportation, but it's by far the largest. It's about 85% of the employees within DOT reside within FAA, and very few political appointees within the FAA, only 5 or 6 most times, whereas DOT is much more politically oriented in many ways. You've got over 100 political appointees that change over usually with every administration within DOT. The other thing that is important to understand is that, Jeff talked about aviation safety and the operation of the amount of the scale of operations within the United States that the FAA is responsible for. The other thing that it does, which is really important to drones, is it has to coordinate any rulemaking activities or significant policy, not only with DOT, but also with the Office of Management and Budget, and then the other federal cabinet departments, particularly Homeland Security, DOD, NASA, Department of Energy, Department of Interior, and the Department of Justice, FBI, but not limited just to the FBI. So as you can imagine, particularly in this day and age, those departments certainly have a lot to say when the FAA puts out a regulation that might impact where they are. Now, the agency itself is comprised of 5 lines of business: got aviation safety and air traffic, which I talked about. You've also got the Office of Airports and You've got airspace security and hazardous materials, dangerous goods, and commercial space as well, because the FAA is responsible for public safety as it relates to commercial space launches. And those have about quadrupled in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of the cadence of activity. 55,000 flights a day, 29 million square miles. A lot of that is out over the oceans, most of the Pacific Ocean and most of the, well, about half of the North Atlantic Ocean, pretty much everything south of Canadian airspace the FAA is responsible for. Certifies pilots, manufacturers, and aviation operators. On the air traffic side, of course, manages traffic flows and ensures safe separation. And by just about any measure, the U.S. is the safest, but most complex and most dynamic aviation system in the world. And the approach that we take is interesting. You know, U.S. pilots in the U.S. do visual approaches at about 2 or 3 times the rate of the rest of the world. And this leads to a system that often is more flexible than what you see in the Far East or in Europe and other densely populated areas. And it explains somewhat the FAA's approach versus the approach that Europe is taking on drones, for example. Europe is a lot more structured, much higher percentage of IFR operations, instrument flight rules operations. Some of that's obviously weather, but we sweat our assets a lot in the aviation system in the U.S. We don't slot control airports, for example, whereas in Europe, the last time I checked, they had more than 50 slot controlled airports. So they artificially constrain capacity in some cases. We don't do that in the U.S. We pretty much plan for perfect weather conditions all the time, and then we manage by exception, which is kind of the opposite of the way the rest of the world takes their approach. Now, as we know, on UAS, current state of play, you know, the commercially owned drones are contributing to our economy, and they have been for a number of years. We all want more cost-effective and predictable ways to get approvals and to be able to operate at scale. But if you think about it, I know there's oftentimes a lot of questions about how fast things are moving. And although drones have been around now for maybe about 20 years or so, really the small drones and the kind of commercial applications that we're talking about really started to ramp up in the mid 2010s. And if you go back and you look at, for example, NASA's concept of ops on UAS traffic management, that was published in 2017. And so in that time frame, we've had multiple public-private partnership programs and a lot of proving of concepts that have gone into reality in many cases. And this has informed the rulemaking and policymaking responsibilities that the FAA has had to execute. Really important because we need to make sure that all kinds of operators have access to the airspace, whether it's a light aircraft, commercial aircraft, military, public safety, or agricultural operation, package delivery, the kinds of activities that we see under demand and heavy demand in the drone community. So if you go back and look at that last 8 years, the Part 107 rule in 2017, the initial commercial approvals, the integration pilot program, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, between 2017 and 2020, I talked about NASA publishing its concept of operations, which we've continued to build on in 2017. The remote ID and operations over people rulemaking, which were foundational, they were necessary prerequisites for beyond visual line of sight. That was all done in 2019 and 2020. And as an interesting aside, when I was administrator, COVID hit a few months into my tenure. And when the travel schedule gets cut and the lawyers are always available for meetings. It's amazing how productive and how quickly you can move some of that review process forward. They would give me a 200-page document, and I'd return a red line version to them within 24 or 48 hours. I would never have been able to do that if I had my normal travel schedule and meeting schedule that you had pre-COVID. So there were some benefits to that, which is a little bit counterintuitive. There was also other work, though, that got slowed down a little bit. Some of the testing and out in the field and all that had to figure out a little bit different way to approach that for a few months. I can go over a few numbers here. I won't bore you with great detail, but over 800,000 drone registrations. A little less than half of those are commercial. Almost 400,000 remote pilots. The numbers keep getting bigger and bigger every year. Over 32,000 delivery flights last year, and that trend has been doubling. I went back and looked at the data for the last 5 years. That trend has been pretty much doubling year over year. So it's going to continue to grow exponentially. We've increased the number of training schools in the U.S. for licensing up to 134, which is a pretty steep increase. And I talked about the rulemaking progress, but I'll get into a little bit more detail about beyond visual line of sight in a minute. Now, moving on to the FAA's approach, I think it's important to understand when you're dealing with the FAA. When Jeff and I were growing up and were beginning our aviation careers, rulemaking was very prescriptive, and as an operator and a manufacturer, the frustration a lot of times is, well, just tell me how high the bar is and I'll jump over it. And so you've got this you want a laundry list of rules that you can design to and form your operations around. The problem with that is that we don't want to design a set of rules that only work for manned aircraft or only work for one part of the drone community. It might work for linear infrastructure inspection, but may not work for something else, and may not allow companies like Target Arm to be able to integrate various aspects of what they're trying to do. So, the old way was, it's against the rules. You can't do that. Well, now it's kind of flipped on its head. It's the approach for the last really 20 years or so has been, well, tell us what you want to do, and then here are some ways that you can comply or some ways that we can manage that risk together, whatever it happens to be. And so the risk-based approach, you'll hear a lot about that. And so what the agency has done is a risk-based approach, but how do we achieve that? We achieve that by, okay, we've got our existing regulations, and let's start to operate with waivers and exceptions under those regulations. That will inform future rulemaking, provide some of that economic justification that's very important to be able to do the coordination across the government, make sure that we can operate at the level of safety that the public expects, and then build from the bottom up within the national airspace system. And so this is really the goal has been all along, and continues to be, integrating drone operations into the national airspace system that was designed, frankly, for manned aircraft over decades, but do that in a way that's smart, that allows UAS to operate and be successful, but not get into issues where we've got, where safety is being compromised for the entire system. This is also really, I think, illustrates the importance of industry consensus standards. We don't want the government to decide what the standards need to be. We need for industry to say, okay, this is what we think we can do. And this is a little tough for the private sector sometimes, because you've got companies that are in competition with each other that have to work together and collaborate to define what those consensus standards should be. Now, there are various organizations, ASTM and IEEE and others, that the FAA is using along with industry. Everyone's recognized that they can bring the private sector together along with the government, and so we can work to move that forward. But I guess what the punchline here is, although it seems like things move slowly, what you're doing is going slow to go fast. Because if you go too fast in these things, you'll end up with some sort of a niche capability that doesn't have security or cyber concerns addressed, or maybe there's public pushback in an area because all those policies haven't been considered, and it may work for one segment of the industry and not another. Now, there are some forums, some mechanisms that the FAA will use, both internally within the government and with industry. And I'll just go through a few of those. First of all, the UAS board at the FAA meets every 2 weeks and makes sure that there's not duplication of effort across the agency, and that the initiatives, whatever one department is trying to do with the task that it has to perform as part of policy and regulatory approvals or operational approvals, that it's getting the support from the front office of the FAA that it really needs. So every 2 weeks, chaired by the deputy administrator. There are some steering groups under that. There's also a good bit of research that's done both in Oklahoma City at the FAA Center there, and also at the FAA Technical Center in Atlantic City. And that there's a research roundtable that meets on a regular basis to make sure that all the research aspects for future developments are being considered. Externally, FAA works with the Executive Office of the President, the White House. I talked about DHS, Commerce, DOD, Department of Energy, Department of the Interior, Justice, State Department, and NASA. This is a quarterly forum that comes together, the UAS Executive Committee, to make sure that federal and public safety uses of UAS are coordinated, and that those capabilities continue to be developed. And then there's a number of other ways that industry participates directly. The Drone Advisory Committee, which has been rebranded a few years ago as the Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee. A lot of work on spectrum. You know, we just saw the impact that, you know, when the FCC approves certain uses of spectrum, we want to make sure that that doesn't interfere with either the government's use or the aviation sector's use, whether it's a private company like a UTM service supplier who's trying to make sure that data is correctly shared and is not subject to cybersecurity risk, as it provides services to the drone sector. As these things will be really important for beyond visual line of sight operations. And then I talked about standards development organizations all the time. You know, ASTM, probably the most important one in the drone space, but you've also got IEEE, RTCA, and then over in Europe, RTCA's equivalent, which is EuroK. And then, of course, international forums. There are a number of university partnerships in the U.S. That are, the FAA will have a research question that it needs to have answered. A lot of times that will take the form of a university, maybe like Embry-Riddle or someone doing that analysis and then bringing it back. And then, of course, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee, or the BVLOS ARC, which did its work a couple of years ago. A little bit of some of the successes. So I talked at the beginning about the integration pilot program between 2017 and 2020. So this was actual operations. There were 10 partners. Some of them were cities. There were some state departments of transportation. I think North Dakota, Kansas, and Virginia. I believe North Carolina, I know, was one. There were tribal governments, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, airports, Memphis Shelby County Airport. So all of these partners were chosen because there were certain things that they wanted to be able to do with drones, and so these partners were chosen to be worked with to basically make sure that as rulemaking was done, and also as data was collected for cost benefit analysis, which was going to be very important to rulemaking, that we were looking at a broad swath of specific commercial applications and public safety applications for drones. So essentially, the goals of the IPP, there were really three of them: safely integrating UAS into the national airspace. They did over 21,000 flight operations, issued the first 2 air carrier certificates for drone companies for cargo delivery, and then did some advanced BVLOS operations in a controlled environment. Also looked at the societal benefits. Again, not necessarily something that the FAA as an aviation safety agency would be looking at, but these were things that we were going to have to use as part of the rulemaking justification to go forward to the Department of Transportation and OIRA within the Office of Management and Budget. So looked at expanded access to goods and services, improved provision of medical services, disaster response, and then also figured out what the best way to engage the public on drones is. It's sort of like dealing with aircraft noise issues. You're much better getting out there, engaging with the public, and answering the tough questions than you are sitting behind a desk in Washington. It's much better to get out there and figure out what the really important issues are. Also progressed type certification for several vehicles, established the command and control links testing for UAS networks, did some initial environmental review, again, of an important part of the rulemaking process, and then, of course, demonstrating equivalent level of safety as well. So number of findings on that. I think while I'm talking about rulemaking and the federal government, I think it's important to understand that we're obviously in election season here in the country, and although the FAA is an apolitical aviation safety organization, it lives in a political world when it gets into these other policy areas. So I talked about coordination across the federal government, but when you're trying to get rulemaking done, you've got to kind of think forward on what kinds of policy issues, environment, for example, or noise, security, what kinds of issues am I going to have to be thinking ahead of that are going to be important to one or more stakeholders, either within the White House or the cabinet branches as well. The previous administration to this one had a very strong deregulatory agenda. In fact, it had the rule on rules, which was 2 for 1. So anytime you put a rule out there, the Department of Transportation was held accountable for deregulating at twice the value that it regulated. And so the FAA actually provided a lot of that regulatory goodness on that side. It's not to say that those issues aren't important now, but there are other policy issues that may, if you rack and stack them, the priorities may be a little bit different. And so it's important to understand in any presidential executive department transition, there's the potential for some loss of momentum. And so again, in terms of beyond visual line of sight rulemaking, it's good news. The notice of proposed rulemaking should be out in August. I talked to the head of rulemaking last week, and but then there's another bunch of activities that have to happen. That's got to be reviewed by the department. That'll probably take a couple of months, and then by the White House, probably another couple of months, and then of course, once the NPRM is published, then we'll take public comments, and that's where the interagency coordination process will happen. So I'm expecting to see a final rule on beyond visual line of sight. The draft rule will come out probably by the end of the year, and in the spring of 2026, we should have a final rule by all indications. After the integration pilot program, there was a sequel to that that's ongoing now. It's called Beyond, and again, more sophisticated and better and more scalable operations are coming out of Beyond right now. Number of accomplishments by the agency and by the partners. For example, in October 2022, Virginia Tech University, part of the partnership in Virginia, they had their first means of compliance that was approved for operations over people. Memphis Airport and had a big partner in FedEx, of course, which has its headquarters in Memphis. They conducted on-airport surveillance and beyond visual line of sight operations over people and moving vehicles. So that was a big part of getting us across the finish line. We had Zipline get its Part 135 certificate in June of 22, which was the largest. They had the largest area and greatest distance of any commercial drone delivery system in the country at the time. Also, you had Matternet's M2 drone achieved type certificate in 2022. This was the first non-military unmanned aircraft to achieve type certification in the United States. Alaska, tremendous opportunities. The aviation system in Alaska is very unique, as you can imagine. There's not much in terms of connectivity on the surface because of weather and geography. Really great opportunities, I think, up in Alaska. And so it was very important for the partnership with the state of Alaska and the University of Alaska up there. They got a waiver in early 23 for test flights to enable UAS in controlled airspace. So started to get into talk about operations in controlled airspace up in Alaska, and that'll be eventually scaled down to the lower 48. Rulemaking, again, I can talk about this in a lot more detail. I've kind of skipped through, but remote ID and ops over people were very significant during my tenure and really laid the foundation for beyond visual line of sight. Beyond visual line of sight, again, is the holy grail, right? And to do it by rule rather than through waivers and exemptions. So the ARC was completed 2 years ago. We expect the notice of proposed rulemaking to come out of the FAA in August and then go through that coordination process that I talked about. Typically, the most challenging stakeholders within the government that are where a lot of times we'll get things kicked back and have to address some issues are the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. So those are usually the most challenging. And so a lot of the FAA rulemaking strategy will be to engage them in advance to the extent that you can, and before words actually go on the document to go out. And so we had some success with that while I was there, but it always seems like there's somebody in an office somewhere who's, this is the first time I'm seeing this, and so sometimes things will take a little bit longer than you would like, but I can guarantee you, just knowing the people who are involved, they're doing everything they can to lay the groundwork for an expedited rulemaking process on BVLOS once the proposed rule gets out there. This is a quote from the head of rulemaking at the FAA, who also is a former F-15 pilot like Jeff and I are. But he says that he thinks it's going to be one of the most progressive rules that the agency has put out, trying to lower barriers to entry in the industry, but also being as scalable as possible. So, we'll see. The proof will be when it comes out. Last thing is about UTM. As opposed to manned aircraft, UAS traffic management really fundamentally changes the allocation of responsibility between the FAA as a regulator and the air navigation service provider on the one hand, and the pilot, the industry, and the aircraft, or the drone in this case, on the other. If you think about it, pilots have a decreasingly active role with certain requirements as automation increases. But the rigor of the automation itself and on the UAS itself, and also on industry provided infrastructure. Remember, UTM is not a government system. It is a private sector service providers that are going to be enabling deconfliction between UAS, and eventually the goal is to get it integrated into more complex airspace. So to the extent that the requirements are put out there for UTM systems and they're tested and proven to work, those requirements are going to be significant. And we saw with the I think the CrowdStrike cyber disruption really showed us as a country and as a world how dependent we are on technology these days. So it's really important that these systems are designed as bulletproof as they possibly can be. There'll be new ratings and training requirements for humans that are in UTM supported operations. What you've got to do to fly a drone now, if you're starting to fly it on a regular basis in controlled airspace, which is the eventual goal, then there will be some that training and qualification will start to look a little bit different. I can talk to you a little bit about what the USS systems are designed for, but I won't bore you with that right now, but can certainly get into that in more details. Again, cybersecurity and data integrity, reliability, electronic signatures, all these are parts of what the industry is helping the FAA define in terms of what the capabilities need to be for UTM as we go forward. One of the most important activities, in fact, probably the most important single activity that's going on with UTM right now is in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this is what the FAA calls the North Texas Key Site. And if you think about the Dallas-Fort Worth airspace, you've got a very important cargo operation there at Alliance Field. You've got Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Love Field, a bunch of other airports around the area. One of the largest, most complicated metropolitan areas in the United States. And so when we looked at, or when the FAA looked at places to prove out operations at scale, North Texas was a really good candidate. There's been a near-term approval process implemented for BVLOS. It's relatively new. I think it's been around for maybe about 6 or 7 months now. That continues to be refined. And again, there are a number of sites around the country that would like to expand, but continue to build out kind of operations within North Texas for scalable UAS, UTM controlled operations, if you will. Right now, all that's below 400 feet in less dense airspace, and the airspace approvals are pretty granular. But just with this, in the last year or so, that started to expand and scale well beyond where the original concept is. So this is sort of telling us what needs to be done to enable these operations across the country on a larger scale. A couple of closing comments. Moving forward, the FAA was just reauthorized by Congress a couple of months ago. This was probably the last substantive piece of legislation that's going to be passed before the election. What it did, though, was it gave the FAA the authority to say yes on certain things faster. So it took away some of the bureaucratic processes. It also extended authorities that were getting ready to sunset in terms of exemption authorities, and it also streamlined the agency's ability and the hoops it has to jump through to be able to grant some of those exemptions. Also, I talked about the public-private partnerships under the Beyond program, those 9 sites under Beyond. Those sites now have the authority to issue waivers and exemptions locally, which that was a headquarters FAA function before. Now they have the specific authority to be able to do it locally. And there are a lot of ways you can get up to speed on what's going on. There are regular public events. In fact, starting today for the next couple of days, there's the FAA and Advanced Air Mobility Symposium, drone symposium in Baltimore. Those things happen every so often. There's a number of other ways to engage, and you can get a lot of the information that I've talked about and a lot of the kind of the way forward at faa.gov/UAS if you've got further questions or want to drill down on your own a little bit further. And with that, I've gone on way too long, longer than I intended, but hopefully that was helpful.
No, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, great.
If anyone has any questions for both Steve or Jeff, right now is the time to ask them. And Jeff, to get things started, do you have any questions for Steve?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll pose the first one while others go ahead and enter it into the Q&A, and then Khalil will bring them forward to Steve and myself. But Steve, you've gone over with a great review of all the elements that are required to expand drone use across the United States, from BVLOS to UAS traffic management, the rulemaking that's required, and the public acceptance and safety that's obviously involved. There's a timeline that's on, right? You've talked about some things that'll occur by 2026. Can you give us a feel for, okay, in the perfect world of where we are today on the trajectory we're going, where do we see a full up airspace, national airspace integrated? It'll never stop being changed, but essentially all of it in place, where we have the ability to do beyond visual line of sight throughout the national airspace with crewed and passenger aircraft that are running through there. So the first question is, what do you see that timeline looking like? And then the second part of the question is, what new kinds of business models and impact to the U.S.'s economy is the FAA thinking about from a cost perspective and a revenue GDP perspective?
Well, a lot wrapped up in there, Jeff, and it's a great question. I think that the vision is to have UAS integrated throughout the national airspace system. But you think about what that looks like. I see this happening at low altitude and getting as much of the community as we can in there, let's say below 400 feet initially. And so you're going to be able to enable, a lot of package delivery operations, infrastructure inspection, et cetera. And the UTM systems that are on the drawing board now and that are actually being out there used, some of which are actually services that drone manufacturers are providing to themselves, but also marketing to others. Those are out there. And I see that happening in a much larger way once the BVLOS rule is out there. So you're talking, 26 to 28 potentially. I think things are going to start to ramp up in the low altitude airspace even faster. But when you look at integrating fully with into the controlled airspace, now you're going to create a requirement to start to interface with air traffic control systems. We don't want to get to a point where, right now in the manned airspace, it's a controller either talking to a pilot on the radio or communicating via data link, text message, if you will. And there's a lot of very rigorous certification requirements that have to come into play there. And so when you want to interface with that, there's a whole new set of rigor that you have to go through to be able to certify those kinds of systems. Now, We do see the same thing in manned aviation. You know, when you have a light aircraft, you know, the design level of rigor and frequency or robustness, if you will, versus a Part 25 commercial aircraft, you know, is there are levels of magnitude there. And it's one reason why on, you know, things like electronic flight bags, electronic displays are slower to be implemented on commercial airplanes, because you have to go through, you know, that development aspect. And for example, it's one reason why you'll see a company like Garmin, you know, will manufacture displays and avionics for light aircraft, but they're not in the commercial aircraft space because they haven't been able to, you know, they've made a business decision to not go into that level of risk. That's more Honeywell and Collins and others. So it is going to be, this work is being done now. The issues are being spotted and identified, but I think the focus right now is on enabling and building out from low altitude types of operations, so that then we can have commercial operations, you know, at greater scale when we need to. Now, the other thing though that I should talk about is, even if you're just interested in drones on this topic, take a look at what's going on with advanced air mobility, because that's where a lot of the concepts will be proving. They will be operating and interfacing more when you're talking about advanced air mobility operations. And a lot of that can be used, certainly with respect to autonomous operations. A lot of that can be used to apply to the drone sector, if that makes sense.
Steve, you may want to just elaborate for the audience that doesn't understand what advanced air mobility is and how it's going to be used for taxi services and others.
Yeah, so imagine Uber right now. So imagine you know, helicopters have been a form of advanced air mobility for decades, but these electric aircraft that are being certified now and are proven concepts for companies like Joby and Beta. They've got you know, some of them are focusing initially on, you know, transport type operations for people. Others are focusing on cargo delivery. You know, you've got Whisk, you know, others out there. And so there's a lot of the policy and regulatory implications for advanced air mobility really overlap heavily with more advanced drone operations. But it's basically, you know, for a shorthand term, it's air taxi, but it's not limited to that business model.
Sure. Okay, Khalil, you want to do a couple of questions, and then I'll jump back in if there's extra time.
Yeah. Says here, you briefly mentioned cybersecurity risks. Can you touch on those again?
Sure. So you've got, when you're talking, I was primarily addressing cybersecurity in terms of UAS traffic management. So the way that UAS will operate within this airspace is you want to make sure that, you know, your drone isn't going to hit somebody else's drone that's on a collision flight path. So essentially, UTM is a way to deconflict trajectories, or you can also deconflict on time. So all these concepts are being tested and validated. And you're not working with the FAA on this. I think everyone agreed they didn't want the government, this to be a government-run system. So there are UTM service suppliers. I don't know how many there are in the space now. There's probably a little more than a handful. And so what they're marketing their services is that we can help you if there's a requirement to be able to operate where you want to operate with quite a bit of frequency or maybe beyond visual line of sight, that we will provide these services for you. So it's a matter of, there are certain it enables you to fulfill the requirements to operate beyond visual line of sight in more complicated airspace where there might be other drone activity going on, whether it's public safety, government, or other types of operators that are out there. So what you're machine has to be able to do is to transmit your intent, your flight plan, if you will, where you're going to be flying, when you're going to be there, to this system, and then they can tell all the other operators out there. And if anybody needs to adjust their flight trajectory or altitude or their timing of their operation, they're able to do that. And as you can imagine, this is very data and technology intensive. You're not using, in manned aviation, you look out the window, if the weather's good, and you see and avoid. And so this is not fully what we would call detect and avoid, but it's still very important that that data is accurate and that that other operators know, what type of what the threat is, so that they can take whatever action they need to avoid a collision. So making sure that that you've got the appropriate cyber protocols in place. And I can go through what they are, but they're basically around data integrity and identity. And there's latency issues that you have to be concerned about. If you had a malicious actor out there who was, your data is going through to the UTM system, but it's delayed by a minute, then all of a sudden, the reality that you've been portraying to the other operators out there isn't true anymore. And so, those are the kinds of things that need to be addressed in the cyber environment. Now, that's with UTM. When you start to interface with government systems in manned airspace, now there's a whole level of robustness that's required, because the FAA is the air navigation service provider for the most complicated and safest system in the world, has to be able to incorporate that information into its systems without it being attacked as well. So you do get into a more complex cyber environment when we're talking about controlled airspace and the potential the provision of ATC services to drones.
Great, Steve. One thing you might want to address for the listeners as well. That is that the FAA is responsible for the national airspace, and then what we've got going on is that we've got state regulations that are now starting to get involved and starting to dictate what they can or cannot do with drones. And just use a broad for drones. Local establishments, cities, states, and even regional counties are all starting to think about what they can or cannot do. Can you talk to that about the FAA's role and responsibility and what's delegated down to the state and lower levels?
So it's a great question, and it's something that we could spend a whole webinar on or more just talking about. But the FAA, is responsible for the airspace up, from the dirt up to infinity in the continental U.S. and Alaska. And then it also has, as I said at the beginning, responsibility under ICAO for certain international airspace as well. So the FAA, federal law will preempt state and local. However, as we all know, particularly in this day and age of technology being so ubiquitous in our lives, that there are legitimate concerns for the public for privacy and of course security. I've talked about noise, mostly a manned aircraft issue, but not completely. Sometimes somebody looks up and sees an airplane in the sky, and you'll get a noise complaint even though they can't hear anything. So people are seeing things in places where they're not expecting them. These are issues that the FAA and state and local authorities have to be able to handle. So what the agency does is it works through Congress, but also with state and local entities to make sure that law enforcement, first responder concerns are addressed. But it doesn't help anyone to have a patchwork of regulations, and these things probably will get tested from time to time in court. They have already. If you have a city or town that says, "Well, we don't want any drones," well, they really can't do that. They don't have the authority to do that under federal law. But having said that, it's always good And I know it gets frustrating, but it's good to try to address as many of these issues as you can on the front end, because you're going to have enough evolving issues to address as it is without having turned a blind eye or a deaf ear to state and local concerns. But federal preemption in the vast majority of cases, when it comes to the safety and the operation of the airspace, that's the FAA's responsibility.
Great. Well, next one.
Yeah. ADS.
We got two more here, Steve. We got about 4 or 5 minutes.
ADS-B is used in general aviation. Is this the same for drones?
Not at this time, but there are, and I don't remember which one it is. I know at least one of the UTM service suppliers is using ADS-B data as part of its technical solution for deconflicting flight trajectories. So it's not a requirement at this point. Now, when you get into operations where you're going to be operating more like an airplane and more in controlled airspace, then yes, there will start to be requirements for ADS-B transponders. But those are not. That's not currently, in effect. That's not a requirement for small UAS operations in any case. If you have a larger drone, that's certified like an airplane, well, yes, that's, that'll have to be addressed.
And then will a dedicated 5G/LTE spectrum be needed for these ultimate goals? And would these be granted to national players, or can independent service providers stand of the communication systems needed?
Okay, spectrum's a huge issue. There's no new spectrum out there. And, coming from an industry that doesn't always use spectrum as efficiently as it could, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the airline industry, for example, the systems that are certified and that are on most commercial aircraft are, 20, 30, 40 years old in some cases. And the cost to go back and retrofit that so they're more efficient in their use of spectrum is not something I see happening. So it's really important both for the government and the entire private sector to use spectrum as efficiently as it possibly can. We're also it's also important to make sure that that spectrum is adequate and appropriate to support drone operations, not limited to UTM, but so that operators and manufacturers can comply with the standards that are out there. So this is part of the standards setting discussion. And it's part of certainly something that we all need to be concerned about, because we expect for the growth in this sector to be exponential over the next few years. It already has ramped up very rapidly when you think about it. An entirely new form of aviation. We've had airplanes for over 100 years, and the technology and innovation is ramping up exponentially. So we've got to make sure we've got the spectrum to support that. That wasn't so important to us, 20, 30 years ago, but it's really critically important now.
And then I think we have time for one last question here. How important is encryption to drone controller communications?
Well, it's part of that cyber equation. I'll just leave it at that. It's of critical importance, and because we don't want to create an avenue for again, malicious actors to hack into our systems, even through a back door. So we've got to make sure that our air traffic systems are protected, but also that we don't increase the safety risk and the probability of a mid-air collision or some other type of aviation accident.
Awesome. And then Jeff, any closing remarks to wrap it all up here today?
Yeah, just a quick thing up there. I'll share the last screen if anybody wants to take a look at Target Arm going forward from an investment perspective. But Steve, it's been fabulous having you here today. We thoroughly enjoyed your conversation. As expected, being the administrator, the insight that you have is very rare. Only a few people in the past have ever had the job that you've had. We want to thank you for your service to the country, both in the Air Force and also with the FAA. And hopefully we'll get this business model set up faster and faster for more companies to start using the airspace, because I think there's going to be a massive increase in the GDP that's going to come from this, as we saw with aviation as well. And this is just the next step in aviation as we go forward. Any final thoughts, Steve, as you want to say?
No, just a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation, Jeff. And you know, I left the FAA a couple of years ago, but I think over the last couple of weeks I've been able to kind of update my knowledge sufficiently, so I didn't give you anything that was inaccurate. But a lot of good stuff going on, a lot of great work being done by the industry, and we just need to keep collaborating and moving forward. That's how we're going to be successful.
Awesome. Great. Over to you, Khalil. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you everyone who attended the webinar today. We will be posting a replay of the webinar. So if you need a copy about that, don't worry. We will be sending that over. And yeah, and I also added the Start Engine Test the Waters link here in the chat for everyone.
Great. Okay, good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Steve.
Steve.
Thanks. So long, everybody.